Good day. My name is Alison Ziki. I'm from Room to Read. I worked on this presentation with a colleague of mine, Naomi Mositsa. The focus of our presentation is illustration development models. The presentation contrasts two approaches to illustration development. The traditional approach or the traditional model that Room to Read conventionally uses contrasted against a new model that Room to Read experimented with in the Zenex project. In developing the illustrations for the Zenex project stories, Room to Read departed from its traditional model of illustration development, which usually involves a 5-day residential workshop and follow-up review sessions. Instead, Room to Read experimented with a model where the workshop was spread over 4 weeks instead of 5 residential days, over 4 weeks with 2 contact sessions per week, and a system with a lead facilitator and mentors. This presentation outlines some of the major learnings from the use of this model, and it examines why the model was so effective in producing some of the best children's illustrations ever produced in Room to Read for graded readers. So first, allow me to give a background to what the Zenex project was all about. The project is funded by the Zenex Foundation, and Room to Read is working on the project with 2 other partners, the Nelson Mandela Institute and Motino. The aim of the project is to contribute to building an ecosystem of African language reading resources targeted at young children aged between 5 and 11, and the project runs for 5 years. There is a crisis in South Africa in that the majority of children are not reading, or they are not reading enough, or they are not reading with meaning. Over the last 10 years, both local and international research has found that 29% of grade 4 learners are illiterate, while 58% cannot read for meaning. More than 70% of the poorest half of our children cannot read with comprehension by grade 4. As a result, children face learning difficulties in languages and in all other school subjects throughout their schooling careers. So one of the biggest reasons for reading challenges amongst South African children is the lack of reading materials in indigenous South African languages. Reading materials, both fiction and non-fiction. Now let's take a look at the 2 models that we are talking about, starting with the Room to Read traditional model. Like I stated at the beginning, this was usually a 5-day residential illustrator workshop. And on the first day, on day 1, we would focus on character study or creating the character for the story. And the kind of aspects that we would focus on would include things like giving your character a child appeal, making sure that it appeals to children, giving it a distinctive personality, and making sure that it is expressive of emotions that children can identify with. Then day 2 was usually devoted to an introduction to storyboarding, and would mainly be looking at what storyboarding is and what its functions, the functions of storyboarding are, and how to do a storyboard. Then day 3 was again on storyboarding, but it was about developing detailed storyboards this time. Looking at key elements of a storyboard, like the use of perspective and the use of focus elements. Then day 4 of the workshop would be devoted to color. How, as an artist, you should choose the color palette for your book. So we would look at what is it that influences color choice. So we would discuss things like mood, style, and setting. And then the last day of the workshop would be a kind of review where we would look at what the illustrator has done so far during the week with their character, with their storyboard, and with their colors. But on day 5, we would also then introduce the illustrators to covers, looking at the elements of a good, strong cover for a children's book. So that is how we would do it in the traditional model. It was all very packed and it was fast-paced. And like I said, it would all happen within a week, and usually it would be a residential workshop. With the new model that we used in the Zenex project, the whole workshop was spread over 4 weeks. All right, and it was virtual. It was no longer residential. And we had a total of 8 sessions. And the 8 sessions were divided into 4 parts, with each parts carrying 2 sessions. So the first part was character study, developing strong characters for a book. But this time, with this model, it was more or less taking the illustrator, the artist, by the hand and taking baby steps with them. It was no longer as fast-paced as in the traditional model. So we would take them slowly through the steps of creating, their characters for the story that they will be illustrating. Like would go through things like this is how you do it. Make sure that you read your manuscript at least 3 times. As you read the manuscript, think about the questions and note your answers on the manuscript or a separate sheet of paper on things like who is the main character of this story? What are the emotions this character deals with during the story? What characteristics in this character most appeal to children? How can I make this character unique and distinctive? How will this character be different from the other characters? So we were really taking them, holding them by the hand. And then we would also go through with them through the character checklist that they would then use, fill in this character checklist with as much information as possible, look at the physical traits of the character, what is their age, what is their gender, what are their physical attributes, do they have any identifying characteristics physically? Then also for them to look at internal traits, the emotions of the character, what is it that they like, what is it that they don't like, what kind of emotions are they going through in this story. But also for them to look at the external, traits, the character's environment, who do they live with, where do they live, the kind of relationships that they are in, etc., etc. Then also for them to consider other important characters in the story, like how are the other characters in the story physically different from the main character. So we would do this character study, after which the illustrators would then draw their character, develop their character, and then they would send it back to the facilitator and the mentors, who would then give the illustrators feedback. And we would usually have a plenary session to give feedback to the illustrators. So we would give them an assignment, for example, as the one shown on the screen, which they would then do, and then would give them feedback on the assignment. Then session part 2 was about storyboarding, and again it was baby steps, taking them slowly through storyboarding and introducing storyboarding to them slowly. Like in the introduction to storyboarding, would explain to them what storyboarding is all about. Like it's simply about planning what illustration is going to go onto each page, that they have to think carefully about the image they want for each page, and that they are to be guided by the artwork brief, if there was one, and the text, the story text for each page. And then I would also teach them how to do thumbnails. And then I would also take them through the whole concept of perspectives. So perspectives are used to make a story more interesting, and they have to be chosen. Perspectives have to be chosen carefully. So I would take them through the 4 basic perspectives an illustrator can use, which are upshot, downshot, close-up, or panorama. By perspective, we mean more or less the angle of the shot, how the a character on the page is seen by the reader. Is it a close-up image? Is it a panoramic image? Is it an upshot or a downshot? Let me just show some examples of what we mean here. So this is an example of a close-up image where the face of the character is quite close and in the face of the reader. This is an example of a down shot where the camera is placed slightly above the character whose image is being taken, which is a technique that is used to show a character as insignificant and dominated if it's appropriate for the story. Close-ups, on the other side, on the other hand, are mainly used to show emotion. Then there's also the upshot where the camera is placed slightly lower than the object or the character. And this is usually used to indicate dominance, that the character is dominant, is huge, and he's significant in the story. And then there's also panorama, which is like the bird's eye view. And this one, this kind of shot, this kind of perspective is mainly used when you are showing the setting of a story. So we'll take them through this and explain where to use it and how to use it. This is another example of a panoramic illustration. Another panorama. But we would also take them through focus elements when doing storyboarding. And there are 4 basic focus elements. The teaching here, the real important lesson behind this is that each illustration has to have a specific element that it focuses on. And there are 4 basic elements that an illustration can focus on. It can focus on character, or an illustrator can choose to focus on action, or they can choose to focus on setting, or they can focus on emotion. So there should never be an illustration whose focus element is not clear. It's either you're focusing on setting or emotion or action or character. So this is an example of maybe an illustration that is focusing on character. This one is focusing on action. This one is focusing on setting. By setting, we mean the place where the story takes place, but also the time at which the story is taking place. Was it during winter? Was it during the night? Was it during the day? Was it in summer? Was it during the Second World War? All that is setting. Or was it by the lake during the rain season? And this is an example of an illustration that is focusing on emotion. And this one is an example of a detailed storyboard. You can almost like read the story from the storyboard, just looking at the images without necessarily reading the text. You can get a very good sense of how the story develops or unfolds. So there were several benefits that accrued from the use of this second model for illustration development. The first major one was that the use of mentors really helped the upcoming illustrators, because the mentors held the young artists, the young illustrators by the hand. And in the feedback session, we could really see how the young illustrators, the young, less experienced illustrators, were benefiting from the experience of the older, more experienced illustrators whom we were using as the mentors. But also because the workshop, the whole thing was spread over 4 weeks instead of over 5 days, there was more time for reviews and more time for feedback to the less experienced illustrators. There was less pressure on them. And like in the 5-day workshop, in this model, there's less pressure on the less experienced illustrators. And we found that it made them more comfortable, they could engage more. And in the end, I think it helped them to produce the best that they could. But also, the other advantage of this was that it organically created some communities of practice, in that the less experienced illustrators were introduced to senior people in the field, in the area, and there was networking. And so some of the collaborations are continuing even well beyond the conference, which we found to be very useful. And then overall, I think we got better quality artwork from the use of the second model. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening.